Hey, Legal Rebels, this is Tom Martin. I'm the founder of LawDroid, and this is my podcast, LawDroid Manifesto, where I interview legal innovators about how they do what they do. In this episode, I interview Natalie Ann Knowlton, Associate Director of Legal Innovation at the Stanford Center on the Legal Profession and founder of Access to Justice Ventures, whose unapologetic advocacy and deep research is challenging traditional legal practice to create a pathway for broader access to justice. Welcome to the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. I'm your host, Tom Martin. I'm really thrilled today to have on Natalie Ann Knowlton. Natalie is the Associate Director of Legal Innovation at the Stanford Center of the Legal Profession, and also a founder and principal consultant at Access to Justice Ventures. And she is also the recipient of being honored for being a legal rebel by the American Bar Association and a woman of legal tech. She's also an unapologetic access to justice advocate, and I'm thrilled to have her here. How you doing, Natalie?
I'm great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the warm welcome.
You know, you and I have known each other for a while. We kind of move in the same circles, and I think it's really great to have this opportunity for myself and for everyone that's tuning in to learn more about you and how you got started and what you're up to.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be on.
So, look, there's so much to talk about. I do want to spotlight a couple of things we'll get back to, but just right now, access to justice regulation is kind of a question mark. There's a lot of pressure happening indirectly, really, with AI companies starting to actually provide advice and even some services. There's that recent partnership between Perplexity and LegalZoom. And then there's the big, beautiful bill, which might do away with any regulation statewide. I just want to get your initial thoughts on that.
I always say it's an exciting time to be alive, often when it's not necessarily an exciting time. And I've been saying that phrase a lot these days. So do with that what you will. But it is a time of turbulence, I would say. A lot of things are uncertain, and things that, for example, you alluded to the current bill that would strip LSC funding, the Legal Services Corporation funding. For those that are listening that are not entirely familiar, that's the parent organization to all the local state legal aid organizations. And legal aid, of course, is the only recourse for many Americans to afford an attorney to access the legal system. And so while certain segments of the political spectrum have been trying to shut down LSC for a very long time, I think we all assumed that, well, it won't happen. They've tried this before and it won't happen. But we're in, and with technology as well, we're in this field of, well, maybe the unthinkable could actually happen. So I think a lot of us are kind of stepping back and saying, wait a minute, we didn't think this was possible, whether that's some of the capabilities of technology today, whether that's the threat to legal aid funding or regulation more broadly. What a time to be alive.
Yeah, there's a lot to keep us on our toes, definitely. All right, so for everyone, that's what we're going to get to a little later on. But as you all know, I love to ask people about their origin story. And I know that you're right now in Colorado, right?
That's correct.
And I also know that you did your master's and you got your law degree in Colorado. But did you grow up there? Where did you grow up?
That's a hard question for me to answer. I know that I was born in Ogden, Utah, so I can say that, but I only lived there until about 6 months old. And then my mom moved to the District of Columbia. So we lived in Northern Virginia, and I spent really my formative years there, although it was before I can drive. And so I do see this, in my life at least, this kind of before I could drive conception of the world and where things were, and then after I can drive. And the world seems a lot bigger when you were able to get in a car and navigate cities and landscapes by yourself. So I lived in the area, the District of Columbia area in Northern Virginia. I did a lot of school trips and sightseeing, but I wasn't really out and about on my own as a human. And so that happened then when my mom moved to Colorado. And I stayed in Colorado for much longer than I was in DC. I won't date myself by saying how long, but I do consider Colorado a home. But if you're listening and you're from Colorado, you might be what is called a native Coloradan. And that's a Coloradan who was born in the state. And a native Coloradan, a real one, actually has a generational Colorado roots. And so if you are not from Colorado and like 3 generations deep, you really can't call yourself a Coloradan. So I would like to call myself one if the locals would let me. But Colorado is certainly where my heart is.
Well, it is a beautiful state. And yeah, it's interesting to know that there's that like validation of like how long.
Yeah, they have bumper stickers that say native.
So until when were you in Virginia, like the whole like Washington D.C., Virginia area?
So until the age of 15, I was in Virginia, and then we moved out to Colorado, to northern Colorado. I then went to high school for a few years in northern Colorado, moved down to Boulder, Colorado for undergrad at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And then after that, I moved to Denver, where I went to University of Denver Stern College of Law and what at the time was called the Graduate School of International Studies, which has now been renamed the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, also at DU. I was in Denver for quite a while, but then moved from Denver to Minneapolis, and then from Minneapolis to the Bay Area, from the Bay Area back to Colorado, then back to the Bay Area, then to Reno, Nevada, then to Tulsa, and then came back to Colorado.
Wow. Lots of traveling around there, and I'm sure there's like lots of lessons learned from doing that much, moving around.
Yeah, it was really valuable. When I left Colorado the first time to go to Minnesota, it was a real sense of being, sorry, can't talk to me without seeing a cat.
That's all right.
It was a real sense of what do I do outside of Colorado? Who am I? This is scary. And then once you, at least in my experience, once you kind of rip that Band-Aid off on moving somewhere new and trying something new, it can become really exhilarating. So opportunities presented themselves in these different areas, and I went for a short period of time in all of them. And so I really, being able to live in different places that I otherwise would not have lived, and even now probably wouldn't move back to when I was younger. I would highly recommend it if someone is in the position of being able to do that. And that's something that kind of fills people's cup. Moving is not for everybody, that's for sure.
Going back for a second to Virginia, what was the town where you grew up like? Like, what was it? A small town? Was it a city? Like, what kind of?
It was Annandale, Virginia, so by Alexandria, which is right across the river from DC. It was it was a sleeper town, a kind of commuter sleeper town for DC. So I didn't really associate with being a Virginian until much later. It was just my mom worked in the district. Everyone who lived near us worked in the district. But it was incredibly diverse. And I remember having a lot of rich cultural experiences with friends there. And that's not to throw Colorado under the bus, but Colorado is not known for its diversity. So when I moved to Colorado, that was a little bit of a shock for me.
Did you feel at all like a pull towards politics or like the law because of having grown up there?
Definitely politics, international politics especially, but it was kind of just the lifeblood of the area where I grew up. And of course, my mom was a government worker, and she was also studied politics when she was in school as well. So she kind of infused that love of learning and that really global perspective in me.
Was there anything that you did, like in high school, kind of act on that?
Oh, high school. So high school was a little bit of a transition for me because I had moved right when I went into high school.
Right.
And that's not a great time in hindsight to move teenagers. And if anyone out there is a parent, and I apologize to my mom so many times as I grew older because I just knew I was a nightmare. And I apologize to the parents out there who have had to do that because teenagers are not the kindest people when it comes to being uprooted. But I didn't, at that point, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I felt really lost. I was in this new place, new friends. when you're young in the teenage years, I think it's hard to keep in touch with people. We didn't have cell phones. This wasn't where we emailed each other a lot. We would write letters here and there, but I very quickly lost touch with a lot of the friends that I had in Virginia. And so I was meeting new people and just kind of felt a little more like a chameleon, trying to blend into different communities. Did not feel that I was this standalone person who had thoughts and dreams and a really clear direction at that point. So that might be a long-winded and really different way of saying no.
Yeah. No, it's all good. And so I'm curious about your mother's influence. You said that, some of the work that she was doing, like, had an influence on you. And I was wondering, like, what are some examples of that, or like maybe some lessons learned from that experience?
Well, I was single. My mom was a single mom, so she had 100% custody of me, and there was really no way around it. She was just going to kind of bleed into everything. She was very, very academic focused. And if I remember correctly, she was the first in her family to go to college. And she made clear that not succeeding academically was not an option, and that it was the most critical thing for me and my career and my future. And she pushed really hard, study hard, work hard, pay attention to the things that at that age I wasn't really sure I wanted to pay attention to, but she demanded that I pay attention to my studies. So I think I lost a little bit of that when I moved to Colorado and lost my way, but she very quickly infused that in me again.
So after moving to Colorado at 15, especially, like, it is a pivotal time. You're kind of making those friends that creates your network, and then moving, like, in the middle of that must have been difficult. Um, but once you got to Colorado, you're going through high school. I'm kind of curious about what, how that process of finding yourself and going, was it within a university? Like, at that point, you had different, like, experiences and options to look at about what you wanted to do. Um, how did that process work for you?
I don't think I had given much thought to what I wanted to do in my future and my life until I was taking a history course, a history and political course in high school. And I had this fantastic teacher, and he really pushed. We read some, I can't even remember at the time what we were reading, but he sparked some conversations and had us talk about issues that I felt very strongly about. And I remember we read de Tocqueville, and I argued with his professor for almost the entire class. And so that kind of really awoken me to the international political kind of aspirations, the importance that I view of society and how society works together. And then from there, it became clear that I wanted to go into politics, but not law. I actually was not at all thinking about law, and specifically thinking about not law, because my dad was a lawyer, and at the time my sister was in law school, and I was very much like, not them. I am not them. And I decided that I was going to go into more of a political realm.
Do you just have a sister, or do you have, like, a larger?
I'm an only child with my mom, but my father has other children. So I have a couple half siblings, and my sister, the lawyer, as he calls her, Stacy, the lawyer. She is one of my best friends now. So we're very close.
That's great. Well, I grew up as an only child, so I know what that experience is like.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, like, the way you describe it, like, that was the exact opposite of what you wanted to do. Like, you didn't want to be a lawyer, you didn't want to go to law or think about it, and you're focusing on politics, which makes a lot of sense. Like, you must have had, like, some early experience of that growing up in Virginia, and, like, the experience of that, and then your mom working in that world. Um, so how did you act on that? You got a master's in international studies where you focused on that, right?
Yeah, so the way that worked is I went to university, and at university, I became really interested in genocide, which is something that's kind of very bespoke interest. And I honestly don't know where it came from, but I took a course on genocide and became really interested in how it happened, and specific focus on the Holocaust, but looking also at Rwanda, and trying to wrap my head around how this happens, how to prevent it from happening, what happens once it's happened, all the different really messy issues associated with kind of humanitarian crises. And then from there, I decided I was going to write an honors thesis. And so I did the whole finding advisors. And what sparked that is, as part of that genocide course, I read this book. And the book is called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And in this book, the premise of this book is that the Holocaust could only have happened in Germany, that there was something so fundamentally different, special, not in a good way, but there was something so foundational about Germany at that time and the Germans in that moment that the Holocaust could only have happened in Germany. And I thought that was absolutely wrong. And I set out for the next year to research and write about why I thought that was wrong and why I thought that the Holocaust could, and in some ways did, happen elsewhere, in magnitude just as great as happened in Germany at the time. And I focused specifically on some of the Eastern European states. So that, I think, kind of bridged my way into humanitarian issues and humanitarian legal issues. So then I graduated and I decided I was going to take a year off and go work in a grocery store and try and figure out what to do with my life. And that was a rough period because I'd been in school for so long at that point, back to back to back to back, that not having that intellectual stimulation really, really got to me. So then I decided I wanted to go to grad school and I wanted to focus on humanitarian law and humanitarian issues in grad school. But somewhere along the way, law school got like wedged in there as well. And so what was supposed to be 2 years in grad school turned into a 4-year combined program that essentially took all 3 years of law school unchanged and then cut in half the grad school. So I intended to go to grad school and then somehow ended up mostly going to law school.
It's kind of cool that you combine the two things together. So one question I have for you, you didn't really go there, but I want to go there a little bit, is where the motivation comes from. Because, as you say yourself, you're an unapologetic access to justice advocate. And clearly from, what you pursued in your master's, there's an obvious concern, care, and actually work that goes into a lot of work that goes into pursuing that interest of justice. And I am curious where that comes from for you. Is it, the obvious, things that you learned from your mom growing up? Is it maybe an experience that you had? Or is it just something that kind of feels innate that's always been within you?
Yeah, it's the innate feeling, because I don't really have an origin story for that interest. I don't have any family that was involved in the Holocaust. I don't have any family members that were involved in international legal issues. My mom, her work with the government was not focused on humanitarian stuff. So it was just kind of a draw that a passion that sparked when I first took that class in college and then continued on. And I've always been, I kind of tie this back to a personality quirk. I've always been a really emotional person. Some of you listening who know me, that won't surprise you. But I react really strongly to extreme injustices in the world. And so there are certain times that are just very difficult to be alive as a human and kind of process what humans can do to each other. And I've just felt driven in some way to find out if I can contribute, and whether it's on the kind of prevention risk side or on the prosecution, how do we ensure this doesn't happen again side. And I've kind of, straddled both of those at different points in my career. I felt like there has to be something done and that I have to be one of the many, many people who are working towards that. And I know that sounds cheesy, but it's true.
No, I don't think it's cheesy. I kind of connect with that, and I think that it makes you an extremely effective advocate because you literally feel the injustice and wanting to fight it. But on the other hand, the downside that it has is that because you connect with it personally, it could take its toll.
Yeah, true story.
So, law school. You go to law school, and what is your focus there? Do you have an outlet within law school to pursue the justice angle and what to do about that?
Yeah, so I joined University of Denver Law School at a great time because a professor at the time, I'm not sure if he is still there. I should know this though. David Akerson was an adjunct, and he was of the world of the UN criminal tribunals, and so he had landed, and he launched an externship. Literally working with the tribunals, the UN ICTY and ICTR, doing trial transcripts with this technology that he was using at the time, which now would be so quaint. But back then it was a really incredible way, a database of linking up really complex pieces of trials and transcripts and witnesses and evidence, and in a way that's, because these cases that are heard in the tribunals, they last years and years and years. And one of the ones I worked on, I think, last 6 years. I mean, you can't even imagine the number of witnesses, and this is just, ongoing trial. And so it was a real challenge when you had turnover in these institutions for the attorneys to figure out what had happened. And so I jumped right into that, did that there. And then I actually went through Professor Akerson. I went to the UNICTR, which is in Tanzania. And I went in the middle of law school one semester, and I just went and did some work for them actually on site. They had some trial transcripts that were that they believed were too sensitive to transmit electronically. And so I went and worked on them actually in the tribunal in Arusha, Tanzania, which was an incredible experience in so many ways.
Wow. Yeah, I remember seeing that prepping for the show, and that must have been an amazing, like, out of body, like, different experience. That what did you bring home with that? Like, what did you, like, sometimes when we go places that are so different from our reality, that we bring back like a different perspective on things. Did that do the same for you?
Yeah, I brought back a lot of nightmares. I mean, when you're reading these transcripts over and over, it's there's no way that you can kind of just like close down when you go to sleep. That was also the first time that I had been to Africa, and I have not been to Africa a lot in my life. And I really remember getting off the flight, and it's not a big airport, and just kind of smelling like the earth. And you're out, you're not in the kind of closed, what are they called? You know what I mean?
Well, like on
The ramps.
airstrip and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, you're on the airstrip. You're not like on this ramp. At least at the time that was the case. And I just remember seeing the dust and smelling the dirt. And it was a humbling experience for me, as kind of like a prissy kind of city girl who doesn't camp. And it was very down to earth. And there were some luxuries there, certainly. And I took advantage of them when I could. But it was really, I was there to focus on work. And I spent one of the weeks that I was there, I spent living out of the back of a Chinese restaurant, and just really different experiences. Very humbling to see how people live that are different than you. And I had at that point traveled a lot, but generally to Western Europe, where while there may be differences, they are differences that are somewhat imperceptible to people living in the US, or at least people where I have lived in the US. So it was humbling in that way, but also it's probably, as I'm talking to you now, it's one of the first times that I remember sitting in restaurants at night working, because I had so much work to do. And that's certainly something that I do these days. But I had a lot of work to do in a very short period of time, and I was committed to getting it done.
And what was the outcome of that? Like what like on that in particular that you were working on when you came back? Um, how did that continue? Like, how did that work out?
Well, I continued on with the externship. I had a dream at the time of going and working for the UN, either in that tribunal or another tribunal. When I graduated from law school, things changed. And at the time I graduated, I wasn't really ready to pull that kind of trigger. So I stayed in Colorado. But it, I think, opened the world for me in terms of my career doesn't need to stay in Colorado, doesn't need to stay in the US. And I think the importance of just focusing on international issues was really front and center.
Did you continue that?
I continued domestic issues. I did not continue working on international issues. I think part of that, if I can just have a vulnerable moment, is I had just graduated from law school and grad school. I was in a relationship. I had a cat. So I had this animal, and most people probably laugh and say, well, you can definitely leave the animal behind. But I didn't feel like I could. And I had to focus. I felt pressure from my family to focus on, all right, you've got to get out there and start working. And so I didn't feel I necessarily had the freedom to go out and experiment with working in different countries or trying to hunt down a UN contract. So I also, though, at the time I had been working at ILES, which I know that you know, and a lot of, I think people would know ILES who would listen to this, and that's the Institute for the Advancement of the American Legal System at the University of Denver. So I had started working for ILES from the very beginning of law school as an internship and then a fellow, and ILES was ready to take me on when I graduated. And so in addition to the deciding to not go abroad, I had this fantastic opportunity working with a growing team and essentially a startup environment of like 3 or 4 people, focusing on issues that were entirely new to me. I thought the law was great when I was in law school and there were no systemic issues, at least none to speak of. And then I come to ILES and realize that, oh my gosh, there's some real problems here. So ILES really kept me grounded, literally and figuratively.
And it sounds like it definitely like satisfied that need for rooting out injustice, fairness, bringing fairness to people, like so that they can have access to rights that they would otherwise not be able to enjoy or take action on. And I know that you were, there for 14 years. You worked over 14 years at ILES, right?
Yeah. 14 years officially, I think, and then several years in school.
So take us through that a little bit. I mean, not literally step by step, but what was your progression like from when you started there towards the end? Like what were you working on to start with, let's say?
Yeah, so when I first started working there, I started working on issues of judicial selection and judicial performance evaluation. At that time, I had no idea how judges were elected or selected. I just assumed they appeared and got the job. And I did not realize the role and influence of money in politics on selection. And I didn't realize the tension either between retention elections and the whether these retention elections are partisan or nonpartisan. Now, we all want nonpartisan judges, but most people actually want to understand what the partisan stance is of their judge. And we were working on those issues and researching and trying to understand what models worked best and what the downfalls were of those models. From there, I transitioned to working into civil justice reform. And this is where I started getting a really, I would call now 100% holistic picture of what access to justice means. I've always said, or at least, in the last 10 years, I've said that access to justice to me means from the poor of the poor to the Fortune 5. And this is where I kind of got that perspective. We did a bunch of research at the time on high value civil litigation. So massive discovery and massive expert witness costs in some cases, and appreciating that the civil justice system is incredibly complex and incredibly expensive. And when you're dealing with most companies who are, farming out to counsel, you're paying those litigation costs as a customer because they're putting that into what they charge for goods and services, and they're passing that on to you. So it is an issue for corporate access to justice, but also an issue for the average consumer, because the more it costs to litigate cases, the more people are going to pay for goods and services. So I spent about 10 years working in those different issues. And then I had this really pivotal moment of appreciating what the family law system looked like. And Julie McFarlane, who's a professor from Canada at University of Windsor, I believe, she came and talked to us one day about a study she had done of self-represented litigants. And I was like, what's a self-represented litigant? And she explained how in Canada, many, many, many people represent themselves in family cases in particular. These numbers are especially high. And so I started doing more and more research and diving into that and appreciating this, what many of my mentors and many of my colleagues who have been in this field longer than I have know, that family cases are often overrun with people who don't have adequate legal help. And that's the point at which I say I was radicalized. I was very hesitant to go into that issue at Isles because I thought divorce, separation, I'm a product of divorce from a very young age. I don't want to learn about what divorce does to children. I'm not interested in that kind of dialogue. Someone else can handle that. But it was really interesting to actually see what divorce does to children, and not necessarily the divorce itself, but the arguing and the fighting and people who don't have adequate resources, and what the toll that takes on children and families. At that point, I started kind of getting into, well, what are the access to legal services issues, and what is access to justice? Is it access to a lawyer? Because in family cases, lawyers can be very triggering for parties. It can increase adversarialness, which then absolutely increases the impact on children if they're having to be in this very adversarial environment where their parents are fighting. And maybe they could have gotten through the process without that kind of acrimony. So at Isles, and in my kind of research, we started looking at non-adversarial ways of resolving family issues. And that doesn't mean non-attorney necessarily. It just means that we launched actually a pilot on out-of-court resolution for divorce and separation cases in Colorado that was piloted at the University of Denver. And I just really, really got into the access issues, and then began working on regulatory reform, which is probably what most people are familiar with when they think about my work, and where I'm working really closely today. But the need that I saw throughout that entire kind of tenure at Isles really feeds into my passion around the need for regulatory reform now.
And I can see how that, became much more focused and much more, like having a personal connection to it as well, allowed you to get, into a concrete problem and work that. A couple of questions though, like the first one is, for people that aren't familiar with A2J, like you and I, you immensely so, like me, like going to conferences and we talk about A2J, and it's kind of all very much at a superficial level. And actually now it seems like we're able to do more about it than we were in past years. But what is a misconception or something that people that aren't familiar with it just don't get, that you really, really wish that they would?
That it's not just about low-income people. I think that's an intentional marketing technique actually used by some organizations, not necessarily in a sketchy way. But the prevailing narrative is that access to justice is a low-income issue, and it's actually a much higher income issue than you'd think. And I'm not just saying that because of my prior comment about how I see access issues everywhere, even in corporate 500. The reality is that the legal system is insanely expensive, even for people like you and I, making you and I kind of salaries. And people, it's not necessarily the case. Another related misconception is that, well, people who are making a certain amount of money can afford an attorney. But I learned this the hard way when I was going through a lot of personal issues with my mother and elder care, and having to pay. I was making a good salary, but I was also paying an incredible amount for other issues, health issues in my life, issues related to my mom and her health. And so net, I was bringing in maybe $300 a month after all my expenses. And, that's not in a position to really be able to afford legal services. So it's not about low income people. And income is really a bad way to assess whether or not someone can afford something. You need to look at what else they have to afford and what kind of trade-offs they're making with the money that they're bringing in.
Yeah, absolutely. That net income way of approaching it would make a lot more sense for a lot of people. But even when you can afford it, sometimes it's not just the money, right? It's like the stress and anxiety of having to deal with it.
Yeah.
I was also curious, like from that experience that you had at Isles, what did you do next with that?
So next, when I left Isles, I launched Access to Justice Ventures, which is a consulting company that one day might be a venture capital company. That was kind of the dream, but I don't see necessarily a space for my talents in that field at the moment. And so I have additional work and research to do, I think, from a kind of passion and motivation standpoint, still in academics. But I work with a lot of interesting companies on a consulting front to explore ways in which they can operate and do what they're doing, access to justice kind of focused, without running afoul of professional regulation. And so I'll do a lot of preliminary research and conversations with clients, and then ultimately, kind of ironic, but ultimately I'll say I would recommend that you get an ethics lawyer and get a letter. Here's some of the questions that you can ask so that you are at least knowledgeable about the issues going into talking with someone who's going to charge you $800 an hour probably. And so Chase Hurdle, who's my partner, we have the benefit of having a great network of compliance attorney friends who we just give numbers to and say, you should contact this individual. They're highly qualified and they can help you figure out if your specific issue in that state is going to fly in terms of regulatory issues.
Your work at the Stanford Center on legal profession, it seems like a natural fit with everything that you've described so far. How did that come about, and what kind of work are you doing there?
Yeah, that was definitely a dream job. And so when that came up, I absolutely jumped on it. Lucy Rica, who is the executive director, is someone who I have known for many years, worked with tangentially on the regulatory front. She was formerly with the Utah Sandbox. She was the executive director there. I have incredible respect for her and her colleagues and the co-directors, the Freeman Engstroms. And so when the opportunity arose to become part of that institute, I just had to jump on it.
And what's an example of a project that you work on there?
So we just recently published probably what I've been working on the most, a lot of tears shed on this one. And this is an update to a report and a research study that the center had conducted that came out in 2022. So by way of background, in 2020, both Utah and Arizona made really sweeping changes to how they regulate legal entities. So under traditional regulation, we regulate the roles, we regulate lawyers. And then in the states that are expanding out to who can practice law, we regulate the non-lawyer providers. But these two states decided to do entity regulation, which means that the regulatory purview covers the entity itself, which then by nature covers the individuals in it, whether or not they are regulated as lawyers or not. And so there are a lot of benefits to entity regulation. But the interesting thing is Utah and Arizona did it in two very different ways. Utah decided to implement a legal regulatory sandbox, and regulatory sandboxes are regulatory mechanisms that have been implemented commonly in fintech and other ag tech, med tech areas. Utah was the first in the United States to do that for legal. And Arizona just said, you know what, we're just going to scrap the rule that prohibits lawyers and non-lawyers from sharing fees and co-owning law firms. So in Utah's regulatory sandbox, you can get a waiver of that rule. You can also get a waiver of unauthorized practice of law to allow non-lawyers to deliver legal advice. But Arizona just focused on the fee sharing and ownership. And so the first report looked at 2 years of application information for the entities that were active. And we, for this report, looked at and analyzed the applications for the rest of up until, I think our cutoff was the end of this April. So, over almost 200 entities, new entities. And so that was really great getting that out. There'll be another one in 2 years when the Utah Sandbox ends, and then we'll kind of see where we are with regulatory reform methods.
Interesting. So, one of the things that comes up often when deregulation or allowing non-lawyers to own part, and the whole non-lawyer versus lawyer thing has been also a debate of using that kind of language. But it's clear to understand that if you have an unlicensed person and a licensed person sharing a law firm, the ownership of it, most ethics rules in the United States for most states say you can't do that, except Arizona. And so the risk or the concern that gets bandied about in making that argument to kind of support the existing rule is that if you get unlicensed people in there, they're going to be so profit driven, they're just going to drive the profession and the service, the provision of legal services down the drain because it's going to be just profit driven. So from the report you did, you probably saw the kind of feedback that people were giving about the different, private companies that were providing legal services. Was that a concern? Like, was it a major, problem with those companies that people were complaining about them being profit driven and them not getting what they're looking to get out of it?
So the methodology of the report was reviewing and coding the application information that the entities had submitted. So we didn't do outside interviews of individuals in the community or clients, but I'll say in response to your question that there's hardly any evidence of any consumer harm. So Utah, the way that they're looking at consumer harm is they were measuring number of services offered, and then instances of consumer complaints that fit into these harm categories. And there, up until the end of April, were 20 consumer complaints compared to like 6-digit services offered. So I think in the report, and the numbers escaping me, I think it's a rough ratio of there's one harm to every 5,000 plus services delivered, which is pretty impressive. I mean, we don't have those numbers from lawyers. It would be fantastic if there was that kind of transparency in lawyer legal services delivery. But that seems fairly low. And then in Arizona, they aren't collecting that kind of data, but we have 2 different sets of disciplinary cases for 2 different entities and the compliance lawyers for those entities. And profit-hungry companies are not the issue at the root of either of those disciplinary orders. So I'm well familiar with that criticism. But law firms are profit-hungry entities, and I don't know anyone who could really, in a kind of honest mood, disagree with that.
Especially when you look at the measures of success, and like you have a profit per partner, percentage that's highly tracked, and how much, and it literally puts in stark terms that it is very, very profit driven.
And the Arizona Supreme Court, I'll just note, I find their argument to be very compelling. The Arizona Supreme Court essentially said that Rule 5.4, which is where the restriction lives on fee sharing and co-ownership, this is essentially an economic restriction. It's not an ethical prohibition. And if you want to deal with lawyers' independence, you want to deal with client communication, conflict of interest, those all have other rules. So taking this rule out has no bearing on lawyers' adherence to those other rules. And so this is an economic thing, not an ethics thing.
Well, with the time we have left, I do want to ask you at least one, AI related question, which is, it does seem to be, a different category of technology that we could use to the advantage of helping spread access to justice. Do you think it is? And do you think it is that? And then do you think that in some ways it's overcoming these regulatory barriers just from the force of will and the size of the companies that are employing it?
So I definitely think it is, to the first part of your question. I know it's not perfect, and I know it messes up in some ways that make a lot of headlines and people can't seem to stop talking about. But if you were familiar before generative AI came out, and the more sophisticated generative AI came out several years ago, if you were familiar with the online resources available to litigants, you would probably think AI hallucinations are quite sophisticated because the information on the internet is largely trash. And unfortunately, pages like state court websites don't rank high enough for a lot of litigants to see them. And so they're looking at blogs and other terrible materials that are largely unhelpful. So in terms of self-represented litigant exposure to unhelpful or irrelevant information by a generative AI, I actually don't see much of a difference. But I think it's probably less likely to receive that kind of information than someone just going on a hunt and peck through the websites that come up on a Google search that might not even be accurate. So that's kind of where I feel on that one. And maybe I'll be proven wrong and it'll be the death of access to justice. I don't know. On the second point, I think a lot of interesting issues are being raised here, and not just on the size of the companies and the enforcement abilities of state bars against those companies, but on whether what is practicing law? Is it what a human does? We know it's what a lawyer does, but is it what a human does? Can technology practice law? Are we giving it that kind of sentient the function where it is something that is capable of being prosecuted? And should we go after the companies for this? I don't know. I don't really see that being a compelling or winning argument. And I certainly don't see the California State Bar, and I just mentioned them because they seem to be the ones to always go after companies. But I don't see them kind of going after Microsoft and OpenAI. And if they don't, then I don't know how they can go after smaller companies that are in this space, that are actually doing more to tailor their technologies to legal issues and legal resources than the large foundation models.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, like if you look at the ABA, like the actual language of the ABA rule that defines UPL, which obviously is not required for people to follow because it's the ABA, it's a model rule, but it does talk about a lawyer, a person, a human being. It doesn't talk about software. So like, yeah, there's a lot for interpretation there, and also UPL throughout the 50 states is somewhat ambiguous, and whether or not that actually is like it's not enforceable because it's unconstitutionally vague is yet another question. So there's a lot that needs to shake out. But with the time we do have left, I want to ask you a couple questions that I ask everyone. The first one is, obviously, from everything that you've talked about, you got a lot going on. You have your consultancy, you have the work that you do at Stanford, and many other things. And I'm curious, for the benefit of the audience, like, what advice can you give them about balancing it? Is there such a thing as work-life balance? How do you keep it going?
This is probably not what I should be saying, but this is my reality. I don't have a lot of work-life balance, but I'm also in a position where I don't have a lot of obligations at this point in my life. In particular, I don't have a lot of familial obligations that would prevent me from having such a poor balance of work and life. And so I think, there's, I guess, some privilege to being able to work as much as I want without having to integrate other people into my life. And maybe not privilege, maybe that's a sad state of affairs, but there's that. And then I would say that at some point, maybe around when I became radicalized at ISLES around these access issues, maybe earlier, I started realizing that the people that I interact with in this area are my friends. They're not just work colleagues. They're not just people that I see at conferences. They're people that I want to see at conferences. And they're people who I will go to conferences to see. And so that started getting really blurry then, when most of the people who I consider very close friends are also people who I work with. And we're together doing the work. And so in that sense, I really have no work-life balance, because it is just such a part of my life that my community are the people that I work with. And I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'd say that kind of really shaped up over the pandemic, became very clear to me that was something that I was okay with. And so maybe I could do a little more on the work-life balance front, but right now I don't think I have much. In terms of how I keep it together, I don't know that I do. But for me, I have to say, like, I write it down. I'm still a paper planner person. It's small, it's compact. I like writing. It's the kind of thing that I can take with me. But if I don't write it down, it's not going to happen. I've learned that. And if I've tried all of the things, I've tried to put it on here. I've tried to Monday.com. I've tried Asana, like you name it. I've tried it, and none of it works except for writing it down. And so I write everything down that I need to do in a day or a week or a month. And then I check it off. And I check it off with a pen that has a green check mark on it so that I know visually that it got done. And if it didn't, then it just stares at me. And that's probably the only advice I have, is write it down.
Well, that's helpful. And but because I feel similar, like the tangible, there's something about still having the tangible, like, makes it feel like it's still there. You can't avoid it.
Yeah.
The last question is, in doing all this and going through the checklist and all the things that you do, like, what makes it feel worthwhile for you at the end of the day?
It's that promise of seeing change. And if you ask me, I couldn't really articulate exactly what change that is. Is it a policy? I've certainly been part of policy changes and court process changes and law changes. But I think I'll know it when I see it, when it happens. And I don't know that that kind of foundational change that I've been part of that yet. And so I keep pushing in order for that to happen. Once it does happen, then maybe I can quit the law and go start a cat farm, the feline fantasy for it, which I think about all the time. But I think it's that promise of that day that I can say, oh my gosh, I was part of this and this is incredible.
Well, I think that's a beautiful vision, and I share that, hope with you that that happens one day.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And it's been a pleasure to have you on the show, Natalie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate you having me, and thanks everyone for listening.
So for everyone who is listening or watching, how could they keep in touch with you and learn more?
I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. You can find me still on X at NATALALLEYCAT, Natal Alley Cat. You can find me on Blue Sky at the same, or shoot me an email.
Well, sounds great. Thank you again, Natalie.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you all for watching. See you next time. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. To keep in the loop about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to LawDroid Manifesto and you'll get notified. Thanks for watching. See you next time.